My husband took me to a party. Then black men did this. The moment I stepped into that party, something felt wrong. The lights were dim, the air thick with expensive cologne, and whispers that seemed to hush the second I walked past. My husband's hand rested lightly on my waist, but for the first time, his touch didn't feel reassuring. It felt distant, almost detached. I glanced up at him, searching his face for any sign that he felt it too, that strange, heavy energy pressing into my chest. But he only smiled, his eyes scanning the room, locking onto a group of men in the corner. A silent exchange passed between them, something I wasn't meant to understand. My gut twisted. "Relax," my husband murmured, pressing a soft kiss to my temple. "It's just a party." But it wasn't. The people here, they weren't like the ones I usually met. Their gazes lingered a second too long, their smiles too knowing. It felt like they had been expecting me. I tightened my grip on my husband's arm. "Who are they?" I whispered, my voice barely carrying over the low hum of music. His answer was quick, too quick. "Just friends." Yet, the way those men looked at me, it wasn't casual, it wasn't polite, it was something else entirely. And then, my husband did something that sent a cold shiver through my body. He let go of my hand. Just like that, the last bit of safety I had slipped away. One of the men stepped forward, offering me a drink. His smile was smooth, practiced. My heart pounded as I stared at the glass. I didn't drink, not often, but before I could refuse, my husband leaned in, his breath warm against my ear. "Just take a sip." I hesitated, my fingers barely grazing the cold glass. The man watching me had a confident smirk, his eyes sharp and unreadable. My husband stood beside me, relaxed, as if none of this felt strange to him. But to me, everything about this moment felt off. "I'm fine," I said, forcing a polite smile as I stepped back slightly. My heart pounded, my instincts screaming at me that something wasn't right. The man let out a low chuckle and shrugged. "Suit yourself," he said, taking a sip from his own drink before exchanging a glance with my husband. It was so quick, so subtle, that I almost missed it. But I saw it, that unspoken understanding between them. I turned to my husband, hoping for some kind of reassurance, but he wasn't looking at me anymore. His attention was elsewhere, lost in conversation, like I wasn't even there. My stomach tightened. Why was he acting like this? I had met some of his friends before, co-workers, college buddies, but never these men. Something about them felt different, like they belonged to a world I didn't understand, a world my husband had never told me about. The music in the background pulsed steadily, laughter and clinking glasses blending into a low murmur. People moved around us, caught up in their own conversations, oblivious to the unease creeping through me. I leaned in closer to my husband. "Can we talk?" I whispered. He barely glanced at me, his jaw tightening for just a second before he forced a smile. "Later," he said, his voice smooth but distant. "Later? Number I needed answers now." I reached for his hand, but he pulled away too quickly, stepping towards the group like he belonged with them more than he did with me. I swallowed the lump in my throat, forcing myself to stay calm. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe this was just my imagination running wild. But then one of the men spoke again, his voice low and knowing. "She looks nervous." My breath caught. I wasn't supposed to hear that. Another one chuckled. "Don't worry, she'll loosen up soon." My blood ran cold. I looked at my husband, searching for some kind of reaction, some sign that he would stand up for me, that he would protect me. But he didn't. Instead, he reached for his own drink and took a slow sip, like he had already made his choice. I felt the room closing in on me, the air thick with something unspoken. My husband still hadn't looked at me, and that hurt more than anything else. It wasn't just the way he ignored my unease, it was the way he seemed comfortable in this space, with these men, like he had been here before, like he belonged. I forced myself to take a deep breath, pushing down the panic rising in my chest. Maybe I was overthinking. Maybe this was all in my head. But then one of the men moved closer, his presence too intentional, his eyes lingering on me just a second too long. Relax, he said smoothly, his voice dripping with amusement. You're too tense. We're just here to have fun. Fun? I glanced around the room. The music was loud, the lights dim, and the conversations around me felt distant, blurred together like background noise. But in that moment, everything felt heightened. The way my husband avoided my gaze, the way these men seemed to watch me, like they were waiting for something. I stepped back instinctively, but my back hit someone else, another man I hadn't even noticed standing there. I flinched, spinning around, my heart racing. He only smiled, as if he found my reaction amusing. My husband chuckled lightly, shaking his head. She's always like this, he muttered. Like what? My throat tightened. What was he talking about? You should trust me, he continued, finally looking at me, but his expression was unreadable. I wouldn't bring you here if I didn't think you'd enjoy it. Enjoy it? My stomach twisted. This wasn't normal. This wasn't a casual night out with his friends. There was something else going on here, something I wasn't a part of. I glanced toward the door, my mind racing. Should I leave? Could I? The idea of walking out alone in an unfamiliar place made my skin crawl, but the thought of staying here, surrounded by these men who spoke in vague, unsettling words, was worse. Then one of them leaned in, lowering his voice just enough that only I could hear. Has he told you everything about us? He asked, his tone almost teasing. I froze, because in that moment I knew. There were things my husband hadn't told me, secrets I had never even thought to question, and I was about to find out exactly what they were. A chill ran down my spine as his words echoed in my mind. Has he told you everything about us? My husband's face remained calm, unreadable, but I could feel something shifting beneath the surface. My breathing quickened, my body tense as I tried to make sense of what was happening. The room suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing in, the laughter around me distant and hollow. I glanced at my husband, searching for reassurance, for some kind of explanation that would make this all seem normal, but he only offered a half smile, as if he knew something I didn't, as if he was waiting for me to figure it out. One of the men stepped forward, his gaze heavy on me. She looks nervous, he said, amused. Did you not prepare her? Prepare me? My stomach knotted. My husband chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. She's just overthinking, he replied, his voice too casual. She always does. The way he spoke about me, as if I wasn't standing right there, made my skin crawl. I felt exposed, vulnerable in a way I couldn't explain. My fingers curled into fists, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. Something wasn't right. Every instinct in me screamed that I needed to get out of there. I took a small step back, but another man subtly blocked my path. His movements were slow, deliberate, not threatening, but enough to remind me that I wasn't in control here. The realization sent a wave of panic through me. Why don't you sit? One of them suggested, motioning toward the plush couch in the center of the room. The others watched me closely, waiting. My husband's eyes met mine, and for the first time that night, there was something different in them. Not concern, not love, expectation. I swallowed hard, my pulse racing. I could feel them closing in, the tension thick in the air. And suddenly I knew. I wasn't just here as his wife. I was here for something else, something I hadn't agreed to. And whatever it was about to begin. My legs felt frozen in place, my mind racing for an escape, but every direction seemed blocked. The room was warm, yet a cold sweat clung to my skin. My husband sat down first, gesturing for me to follow. His expression remained calm, but something about it felt off, like he was playing a role I didn't recognize. The men around us exchanged glances, a silent conversation passing between them, one that I wasn't part of. I lowered myself onto the couch, my hands gripping my dress to stop them from trembling. The man who had spoken before leaned forward, studying me. "You really don't know, do you?" he said, almost to himself. I swallowed hard, shaking my head slightly. My husband exhaled, rubbing his temple like this was something he had hoped to avoid. "She wasn't supposed to find out this way," he muttered. "Find out what?" My stomach twisted, and I turned to him, my voice barely above a whisper. "Find out what?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a sip of his drink, as if buying himself time. The men around us waited, their expressions unreadable. The silence stretched unbearably until finally, he looked at me. "Just trust me, okay?" His words were gentle, but they weren't an answer. They were a warning. The air in the room felt heavier now, every second dragging. I wanted to push, to demand the truth, but something told me I wasn't ready for it. Instead, I turned my attention back to the man across from me. He sighed, shaking his head. "She deserves to know," he said, then leaned back against the couch. "It's about the deal." "Deal?" The word sent a chill through me. My husband stiffened beside me, but before he could interrupt, the man continued. "He made a deal with us a long time ago, a deal that required a commitment, a promise." He paused, letting the words settle. Then he smirked slightly. "And that promise? It involves you." My entire body locked up. My breath hitched. My husband didn't deny it. He didn't laugh it off. He just sat there, staring at his drink like it held the answers he didn't want to say out loud. I could barely find my voice. "What promise?" The man across from me tilted his head, studying me again. "That's for him to explain?" His tone was almost teasing, like he was enjoying this twisted game. I turned to my husband, my chest rising and falling rapidly. "Tell me." He sighed heavily, running a hand through his hair. Then, with a look I couldn't quite read, he finally spoke. "I made a choice before I met you," he said slowly. "And now, it's time to follow through." My blood ran cold. Whatever this was, whatever choice he had made, it wasn't just about him anymore. It was about me, and I had no idea what that meant. A shiver ran down my spine as my husband's words settled in. My mind raced, trying to piece together what he wasn't saying. A choice, a promise, and somehow I was at the center of it. My breath came shallow as I stared at him, waiting for an explanation that felt like it would never come. Finally, he met my eyes. "Before we got married, I was in trouble," he admitted, his voice low. "I owed a debt, a serious one." He exhaled, rubbing his hands together. "I made a deal to clear it, but it came with conditions. I thought I had time, thought I could find another way out. But now, that time is up." My stomach clenched. "What does that have to do with me?" My voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the tense air like a knife. One of the men chuckled, shaking his head. "Everything?" I turned to him, dread filling my chest. My husband looked away, his jaw tightening. "I promised something. Someone. In return." He swallowed hard, and I saw the guilt in his eyes before he even said the words. "I promised you." The ground beneath me seemed to disappear. The room blurred at the edges, the voices around me fading into a distant hum. He promised me? Like I was something to be given away? I forced myself to stand, my legs shaking beneath me. You're lying. My voice broke, but I didn't care. You wouldn't do that. His silence was louder than any words he could have spoken. The man who had been watching me leaned forward, his smirk gone. He didn't have a choice, and now neither do you. My pulse pounded in my ears. Panic clawed at my throat. No, I whispered. There has to be a way out. My husband stood suddenly, knocking over his glass. There is, he said, turning to the men. I have another offer. The men exchanged looks. One of them frowned. You think you can buy your way out again? I know I can, my husband said firmly, but not with money. I held my breath as he reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, something metallic. He placed it on the table with a soft clink. The man across from us narrowed his eyes. Then, after a long pause, he let out a slow chuckle. Now that changes things. I didn't know what my husband had just done, but I knew one thing for sure. Nothing would ever be the same again. A heavy silence filled the room as the men stared at the small metallic object on the table. My breath was shallow, my hands clenched at my sides. I didn't know what my husband had just put down, but I could feel the weight of it shift the entire atmosphere. One of the men leaned forward, picking it up carefully. His eyes scanned it, his lips curling into a knowing smirk. He turned to the others, exchanging a silent conversation I wasn't part of. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he nodded. You really think this is enough? My husband didn't flinch. It's more than enough. The man considered this for a long moment before finally setting the object back down. Fine, he said, his voice casual, but I could sense the underlying tension. Debt settled. Relief crashed through me, but it was quickly replaced by anger. My husband had risked everything, had risked me, and only now had he found a way out. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but all I could do was exhale shakily, my body too exhausted from fear and adrenaline. The men stood up, their decision final. You got lucky, one of them muttered before walking away, his heavy footsteps echoing through the room. One by one, they left, until it was just the two of us. I turned to my husband, my chest rising and falling rapidly. What did you just give them? He looked at me for a long moment before responding, his voice softer than I expected. Something I never should have had in the first place. He ran a hand through his hair. Something worth more than money, but not worth more than you. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to trust that this nightmare was over. But something inside me had shifted. I had seen a side of him I could never unsee. The man I married had made choices that had nearly destroyed me, and no matter how much he claimed to love me, that truth wouldn't disappear. I took a deep breath, stepping back. This changes everything. He nodded as if he already knew. And in that moment, I realized the real decision wasn't theirs anymore. It was mine.